Senator Dick Durbin opens the exchange with a question that is as straightforward as it is consequential, a question aimed at cutting through the theatrics that so often surround politically charged topics like the Epstein case. He reminds Attorney General Pam Bondi of the very public statement she made during a high-profile White House media event, a statement that instantly ricocheted across news platforms and social media, that she had the Epstein client list sitting on my desk right now for review. It was not a vague hint. It was not a subtle implication. It was a definitive assertion, delivered with the confidence of someone signaling they possessed access to sensitive, long-awaited information. The public, primed by years of conspiracy theories and rumors around the identity of Epstein's associates, took her words as confirmation that a breakthrough was imminent. But when Durbin presses her for the evidence behind that dramatic claim, the facade immediately cracks. Bondi pivots, not to documents or substantiation, but to reinterpretation. She says she hadn't reviewed the files, that they were merely among a stack that included historically significant but unrelated materials like the JFK and Martin Luther King records. Yet this explanation does nothing to resolve the contradiction, because the issue is not whether she reviewed them. The issue is that she publicly implied they existed in a meaningful or actionable form. If a client list didn't exist, why claim it was on her desk? If it was merely speculative or part broader, unverified documentation, why present it as something concrete and in hand? Durbin recognizes this discrepancy instantly. What Bondi describes now is not what she confidently portrayed then. Her earlier claim appears less like a factual statement and more like performance, the type designed to energize a narrative, draw attention, and position herself as someone holding exclusive insight into a national scandal. The public took her seriously because she intended them to. And now, under oath, under scrutiny, she cannot produce anything to defend that moment. The gap between what she said publicly and what she admits privately becomes impossible to ignore. It's not simply a matter of miscommunication. It is a matter of credibility. And Durbin's measured but unrelenting tone signals that he intends to peel back every layer of that discrepancy. Rather than addressing the core contradiction in her statements, Bondi immediately shifts into a defensive maneuver familiar to anyone who has watched political figures under pressure. She abandons the subject of the non-existent client list and pivots to an entirely unrelated issue: budget transfers for high-intensity drug trafficking programs. It's a classic redirection tactic. Overwhelm the moment with bureaucratic detail in hopes of burying the uncomfortable question beneath layers of procedural jargon. By invoking grant administration, funding structures, and Justice Department operations, Bondi attempts to blur the focus and reposition herself as a responsible administrator rather than someone caught exaggerating a highly sensitive claim. But Durbin refuses to let the diversion stand. He pulls the conversation back to matter at hand, reminding her that according to protected whistleblower disclosure, Bondi pressured the FBI to review roughly 100,000 Epstein-related documents under an unusually tight deadline, and to specifically flag any record that mentioned Donald Trump. This is no small allegation. It cuts directly into the integrity of the investigative process and raises the possibility that the nation's top law enforcement institutions were being steered, subtly or otherwise, toward politically motivated outcomes. Durbin asks a direct, unimpeachable question. If the review was legitimate and conducted properly, why was the resulting July 7th memo unsigned? An unsigned memo of that magnitude is a glaring anomaly. Sensitive findings, especially those intended to dispel public speculation, generally bear clear authorship and chain of command accountability. Without a signature, the document becomes a floating conclusion, owned by no one, attributable to no one, and insulated from scrutiny. Bondi's response offers no clarity. She claims the FBI and DOJ were responsible and that Director Patel had answered those questions, even though Patel's own remarks did little to resolve the underlying inconsistencies. Instead of addressing the substance, Bondi begins constructing an entirely new defensive wall, accusing Durbin of previously preventing the release of Epstein flight logs, a move that shifts the spotlight away from her decisions and onto the senator questioning her. This deflection reveals a deeper strategic pattern. When confronted with facts, create a new controversy. When the question becomes too sharp, dull it by manufacturing an entirely different accusation, one that forces the interrogator to defend themselves instead of pressing forward. Bondi invokes political donor Reid Hoffman, a name she implies is suspicious, despite Durbin stating he had never heard of him. She attempts to conflate campaign donations, committee disputes, procedural rules, and inter-senatorial disagreements into a fog thick enough to obscure the original inquiry. The goal is not to answer question. The goal is to eclipse it. Yet the more she dodges, the clearer it becomes that there is something she does not want on the record. Durbin's refusal to let the distraction succeed signals that the hearing has moved beyond routine oversight. It has become a confrontation over truth itself. Who controls it, who distorts it, and who is willing to stand behind it when the cameras are rolling. As the exchange intensifies, the hearing transforms from a routine line of oversight into a spotlight on political maneuvering in real time. Bondi's evasions grow more pronounced the moment Durbin presses her on the key question: who gave the order to flag any Epstein-related documents that mention Donald Trump? It's a direct inquiry, one with clear implications about whether investigative resources were being leveraged for political sensitivity rather than factual accuracy. Yet Bondi refuses to answer, not by providing context, not by offering procedural explanation, but by issuing an outright stonewall. I'm not going to discuss anything about that with you, Senator. It's a remarkable position for an attorney general, someone whose job is to safeguard transparency and integrity within the justice system. Her refusal reads less like a limitation and more like a warning bell, a signal that the truth may be politically inconvenient, institutionally embarrassing, or legally precarious. Durbin's reaction is telling. He doesn't raise his voice or launch into theatrics. Instead, he delivers a calm but pointed reminder. Eventually, you're going to have to answer for your conduct in this. His words hover in the room like a legal inevitability, a reminder that stonewalling in a public hearing buys only temporary relief. It does not erase the paper trail, the whistleblower disclosures, or the mismatch accounts between agencies. His statement is not a threat. It is a prediction. But before that moment can settle, the hearing abruptly shifts again, this time not from Bondi, but from the senators themselves. Senator Blackburn interrupts, nearly demanding the floor, claiming her own reputation has been misrepresented in the process. She insists that she had, in fact, repeatedly asked for the Epstein flight logs, submitted requests in writing, and that Durbin shut down the committee rather than allow votes or disclosures on those matters. Her frustration is palpable, and her tone suggests she believed the record is being manipulated not just by Bondi, but by the procedural authority of the committee itself. Durbin quickly counters, stating that the committee business ended because Blackburn's own party invoked the 2-hour rule, a procedural mechanism often used to halt or delay markup sessions or contentious motions. He maintains that he asked Blackburn to submit her requests in writing, and that she never did. Blackburn fires back that not only did she submit it, but that his staff knows she did. What follows is an unusual moment of senators openly disputing each other's claims in front of the cameras, each invoking staff, documents, and procedural history as if the truth could be excavated on the spot by sheer force of assertion. The spectacle is revealing in a way few hearings are. Instead of presenting a united front in pursuit of clarity, senators engage in a tug-of-war over who is rewriting the record and who is misrepresenting whom. Their disagreement becomes a mirror of the larger issue, a system where records, claims, and processes are shaped not purely by facts, but by who gets a final say in the narrative. The Epstein case, already a lightning rod for public distrust, becomes a catalyst exposing deep fractures, not just between parties, but within the very mechanisms meant to hold power accountable. In that heated moment, the fog surrounding Bondi's evasions grows even thicker, because the senators themselves cannot agree on the basic sequence of events surrounding transparency, requests, and withheld documents. And this is precisely why Segment 3 is so pivotal. It shows that the hearing is no longer just about Bondi's actions or misstatements. It has morphed into a public struggle over whose version of events will prevail. When even senators cannot align on the fundamentals, the public is left watching not clarity, but chaos. And in that chaos, accountability becomes easier to avoid. What makes this clash so revealing is not just a disagreement between Senator Durbin and Attorney General Bondi, but the way the hearing gradually exposes a systemic failure of accountability. As the argument over flight logs, memos, and written requests intensifies, the proceeding begins to look less like a search for truth and more like a battlefield where each participant is fighting for control of the narrative. Instead of clarity, the public witnesses contradiction. Instead of answers, they get procedural crossfire. And it's in this fog that the most important questions about misrepresentation, selective disclosure, and possible political interference slip toward the margins. Durbin tries repeatedly to steer the committee back toward the core issue. Bondi made a claim the public took seriously, and the evidence behind that claim does not exist. But Bondi's tactics follow a familiar political pattern. When you cannot substantiate your own statements, shift the conversation to someone else's alleged misconduct, raise procedural grievances, or create a rival controversy big enough to overshadow the original one. She invokes donors, accuses Durbin of blocking transparency, and reframes herself as the one demanding openness. None of these points answer the fundamental question, but all of them help her reposition herself as a victim of unfair scrutiny rather than an official who misled the public. Meanwhile, Blackburn's insistence that she requested the flight logs multiple times seems less about Epstein and more about scoring a point against Durbin. She wants to demonstrate that Democrats, not Republicans, obstruct transparency. Durbin wants to demonstrate that Bondi, not Blackburn, misled the public. Bondi wants to demonstrate that she's the one being unfairly targeted. Each figure is locked into their role, defending their own version of events. And in this simultaneous struggle for narrative dominance, the truth becomes almost secondary. What emerges from this confusion is a striking picture of how modern political oversight often functions, not as a unified attempt to uncover facts, but as a contested arena where every player is trying to protect their faction, preserve their credibility, and frame the story in a way that favors their side. The Epstein case, already plagued by secrecy, redaction, sealed files, and endless conspiracy theories, becomes yet another arena where uncertainty is not resolved but expanded. The infighting among senators does not bring clarity. It magnifies the public's distrust. Because if lawmakers cannot agree on something as basic as whether a document request was submitted, how can they be trusted to expose misconduct at the highest levels of government? And in the background of all this is the unanswered question Durbin tried to recenter. Why did Bondi claim she had the client list when she didn't? Why did she instruct the FBI to rush a politically sensitive review of 100,000 documents? Why was the memo unsigned? These are questions with serious implications, but the hearing doesn't get anywhere near substantive answers because the focus keeps shifting, not accidentally, but because shifting the focus is the point. Every moment spent arguing over committee procedure is a moment not spent demanding answers from Bondi. Every time the discussion veers into partisan conflict, the responsibility she should be addressing slips further into the shadows. What should have been a straightforward inquiry devolves instead into a performance, one where officials dodge scrutiny, senators clash over process, and the truth becomes an afterthought lost in the noise. And in that theatrical chaos, the public is left watching a hearing where accountability is not advanced but avoided, where transparency is promised but never delivered, and where the most powerful people in the room seem more committed to defending their own narratives than revealing the actual facts. What becomes strikingly clear as the hearing unfolds is that the question at the center of this entire confrontation is remarkably simple. Bondi made a bold public claim, one designed to draw maximum attention, and when asked to substantiate it, she couldn't. Everything else spiraling around that fact is secondary. Yet the moment the spotlight turns to the discrepancy between her rhetoric and reality, she moves aggressively to muddy the waters. This is not unusual in Washington, but in the context of the Epstein case, a subject long shrouded in secrecy, speculation, and public mistrust, the tactic lands with even greater weight. The public is not just watching an attorney general dodge accountability. They're watching yet another powerful figure treat transparency as optional, weaponize ambiguity, and rely on political noise to drown out the truth. Durbin's line of questioning reflects more than bureaucratic frustration. It reflects a broader fatigue with officials who make sweeping claims only to retreat behind technicalities when challenged. Bondi's insistence that she had not yet reviewed the client list does nothing to address why she framed her possession of it as meaningful in the first place. The context of her original claim, a major White House media event, suggests deliberate intention, not confusion. She knew the public would latch onto her words. She knew referencing the client list would ignite a firestorm. Whether she intended to mislead or simply bask in the attention does not soften the fact that she fueled misinformation at a moment when the country was desperate for clarity. Beyond her evasions, the structural problem becomes painfully visible. Officials can make sensational claims, benefit from the immediate shockwave, and then retreat behind bureaucracy when asked to provide proof. Their initial statements travel across newsrooms, social media feeds, and partisan echo chambers, while their walkbacks happen quietly or, as in Bondi's case, hinge on technical semantics that do nothing to undo the initial deception. It creates a cycle where the spectacle is rewarded and the truth becomes an afterthought. This dynamic is exactly why the hearing devolves the way it does. Bondi's strategy forces Durbin into the role of fact-checker rather than investigator. He must first untangle her previous statements, parse the contradictions, present whistleblower allegations, and force her to address the public record, tasks that slow down the entire process and give her room to maneuver. This tension reveals how misinformation isn't always the product of outright lies. Sometimes it is built from carefully curated half-truths, omissions, and theatrically delivered claims that collapse under scrutiny but retain their impact in the public imagination. As the discussion churns between Bondi's deflections, Blackburn's interjections, and Durbin's attempts to maintain order, the audience witnesses a disturbing reality. Accountability in politics often fails not because evidence is lacking, but because the process becomes so tangled in competing narratives that the truth suffocates beneath procedural clutter. Bondi's refusal to answer who ordered Trump-related documents to be flagged, her pivot to unrelated topics, and her effort to turn Durbin into the accused all demonstrate that modern political defense is less about disproving allegations and more about overwhelming the process until meaningful inquiry becomes impossible. And it is here in Segment 5 that the deeper cost becomes clear. When public officials play these games, they don't just protect themselves. They erode public trust in institutions that are already fragile. People watching see powerful figures dodge straightforward questions and walk away unscathed. They see senators fighting over who filed which request instead of uniting to uncover the truth. They see hearings where clarity is not the goal, but the casualty. In such an environment, misinformation doesn't merely survive. It thrives because the people responsible for correcting it are often the same ones benefiting from its chaos. By the time the hearing reaches its later stages, the tension in the room has fully transformed into something larger than a dispute over documents. It becomes a confrontation over the meaning of truth in an environment where every participant is incentivized to manipulate it. What stands out most is how each figure, Bondi, Durbin, Blackburn, and even peripheral committee members, attempts to anchor the narrative to their version of events. Bondi frames herself as a misunderstood official unfairly cornered by political rivals. Durbin positions himself as a guardian of institutional integrity, fighting to expose misrepresentations and demand accountability. Blackburn portrays herself as a lone Republican force pushing for transparency that Democrats allegedly obstructed. Each one is delivering a performance tailored to their audience, and the truth becomes secondary to the optics. As Bondi continues her evasions, the hearing illustrates a critical flaw within political oversight. Investigations often depend on the willingness of the investigated to cooperate honestly. Bondi's refusal to answer key questions, particularly those regarding the rushed review of 100,000 Epstein-related documents and the directive to flag Trump's name, demonstrates how easily accountability can be delayed or derailed. Without transparency from the top, the system relies on whistleblowers to bridge the gap, but whistleblowers introduce another dimension of complexity. Their claims require verification, yet agencies often slow-walk or obscure that process, creating a haze where uncertainty benefits those in power. The result is a hearing where bombshell allegations sit on the table unanswered, not because evidence is lacking, but because the official with the authority to clarify simply refuses to do so. This impasse helps explain why public trust continues to dissolve. When the nation watches a hearing that should clarify a controversy, but instead amplifies confusion, the public draws the natural conclusion that powerful individuals can bypass scrutiny with enough procedural maneuvering. They see an attorney general who made sensational claims that fuel public speculation, claims she cannot defend and will not fully explain. They see senators arguing over procedural minutiae while the central question goes untouched. They see institutions that appear more interested in managing optics than revealing facts. Durbin's insistence that Bondi will eventually have an answer is rooted in the hope that institutional processes will outlast political maneuvering. Yet, history shows that answers don't always come, at least not when it matters most. Often, by the time accountability catches up, the public's attention has shifted, the political winds have changed, and the officials involved have moved on to new positions, new platforms, or new narratives. Bondi's evasions in this hearing exemplify that dynamic. Her deflection is not simply a defensive tactic. It's a strategy of delay. The longer she avoids answering, the more time she gains to reshape the narrative, gather support, or frame the controversy as partisan harassment rather than legitimate oversight. And while this strategy may serve the interests of individual officials, the broader consequence is devastating to public faith. The Epstein case is one of the rare issues where people across the political spectrum have demanded transparency. It is a case steeped in secrecy, corruption, and the perception of elite impunity. When the public sees even the possibility of political interference in document reviews or selective flagging of names, their skepticism becomes justified. When they see hearings devolve into partisan bickering, their cynicism grows. When they see powerful figures dodge accountability with ease, their belief in institutional justice erodes. Segment 6 crystallizes this reality. The hearing is not failing by accident. It is failing because the people in power are actively shaping it into something performative rather than substantive. Bondi's refusal to engage honestly, the competing narratives among senators, and the procedural sparring all contribute to a spectacle where the appearance of oversight replaces actual oversight. And as long as the performance is convincing enough for their respective audiences, those in power have little incentive to provide the transparency the public deserves. And the striking part is how smoothly the conversation shifts from factual uncertainty to absolute confidence, as if repeating a speculation enough times magically turns into evidence. Every pause, every raised eyebrow, every carefully framed, just asking questions line is engineered to imply wrongdoing without ever having to prove anything. It's a performance. Nothing accidental, nothing spontaneous. The goal is an illumination. It's to plant doubt, to create a fog dense enough that the audience stops distinguishing between what's verified and what's invented. By the time the exchange winds down, the narrative is already cemented. Not because it's true, but because it's been staged to feel true. And when the lights dim and the microphones go quiet, the damage is already done. The soundbite circulates, stripped of context, polished into a weapon for social feeds and cable panels ready to echo it on loop. That was always the objective. Not a meaningful exchange, not a search for clarity, but the creation of a storyline that can outlive the hearing itself. The truth becomes almost irrelevant in the churn of reaction and counterreaction. What matters is the imprint, the suspicion planted, the headline crafted, the conversation derailed. By the end, you're left watching a political theater that has mastered the art of looking like oversight while functioning entirely as narrative production.